James first noticed it a week ago. At exactly 3:15 a.m., his eyes would snap open, pulled from a deep sleep by something unseen. At first, he blamed the streetlight outside, its faint glow filtering through his curtains. But that didn't explain the feeling. The heavy, suffocating presence lingering in the air. It was always the same. His body frozen in place, his breath shallow, heart pounding. And then, his eyes would land on it. In the far corner of his bedroom, where the darkness seemed unnaturally thick, something stood. At first, it was just a shape, a trick of the light maybe, a coat hanging in the wrong way, his tired mind conjuring shadows into something sinister. But each night, the shape became clearer, more defined. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs and an emptiness where a face should be. And every night, it just stood there, watching. James tried to rationalize it. Sleep paralysis, he told himself. A common phenomenon? His body waking before his mind. But he could move. He could shift under the covers, turn his head, even sit up. The figure didn't fade. It didn't disappear. It was real. By the fourth night, he decided to test it. He reached for his phone, gripping it tightly as he flicked on the flashlight. The second the light touched the corner, the figure was gone. But the air still felt heavy, thick with something unexplainable. He turned the light off, and there it was again, unmoved, unchanged, waiting. He didn't sleep that night. The following day, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. At work, his hands trembled as he typed, his thoughts hazy and disjointed. He poured too much sugar into his coffee, forgot names mid-conversation. But the worst part, no one else seemed to notice. No one asked if he was okay. It was as if he was already fading, slipping into something beyond their reach. By the sixth night, the fear had settled into his bones. The moment the clock struck 3:15, his body acted on instinct, his gaze snapping toward the corner before he could stop himself. And for the first time, the figure moved. It started slowly, a subtle shift, a barely noticeable tilt of its head. James's breath caught in his throat. Then, it took a step forward. The room grew colder, an icy chill seeping into his skin. The figure didn't stop. It moved forward again, and with each step it took, the air grew colder. James's heart raced, each instinct screaming for him to flee, to run far away, but his body refused to obey. His feet felt as if they were glued to the floor, trapped, held by something unseen. The shadows in the room stretched farther, the darkness almost alive, curling around him like tendrils. He couldn't look away, couldn't tear his eyes from the figure now mere inches away. Its hollow gaze pierced into him colder than the very air itself. James felt the room closing in. The walls seemed to tighten, shrinking with every shallow breath he took. His vision blurred, the edges of the room warping, as though reality itself was bending. He couldn't tell if the room was shifting or if his mind was playing tricks on him, but the terror gripped him all the same. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, tight, squeezed by an invisible force. His body trembled uncontrollably, but his mind screamed for him to fight, to do anything to escape. But there was no escape. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure stopped moving. The air grew still. Too still. For a moment, James thought it was over, but deep down, he knew it hadn't even begun. The figure slowly raised its hand, reaching toward him. James's breath hitched in his chest, his pulse pounding in his ears. The hand was skeletal, unnaturally long, and as it drew nearer, the room grew colder still. Frost began creeping along the floor and walls. "Why?" James croaked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. It simply reached out, its bony fingers brushing lightly against his cheek. James froze. The touch was icy cold, sending a jolt through his body. It was as if the very touch of the figure was stealing the warmth from his soul. And then, the voice returned. Not aloud, but deep in his mind, a low, mocking whisper. "You can't run from yourself." The words echoed in his mind, growing louder, more intense with every passing second. James tried to push away, but the figure's hand was like iron, locking him in place. He struggled, but it was futile. His body no longer obeyed him. With one final cruel smile, the figure vanished, leaving James alone in the room, gasping for air. The shadows still lingered, but the figure was gone. For now. He didn't know how long he stood there, trembling, paralyzed by fear. But he knew one thing: the figure would return. It always did.